Hello. Hiya. Welcome back to the final session, so session 4. And I'm not chairing, I'm just going to introduce our chair for this session, who is Louise Mackenzie from the Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment. So Louise is an artist, filmmaker, curator and researcher. Her practice explores human relationships with the non-human world, using methodologies based in process, chance, appropriation and translation. With an interest in experimental and experiential practices, sound and new-found media and play play an important role in her work. At HBBE, Louise's research explores relationships between the researchers in the hub, members of the public, and the non-human life in the home. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jane. And so I'm going to, without further ado, introduce our first speaker, who is Oscar Tomico.
Yeah, that's good.
Who is from Elisava University, and Oscar currently heads the Industrial Design Engineering Bachelor's degree at Elisava and co-directs the Design for Emergent Futures Master's Programme in collaboration with the Institute of Advanced Architecture of Catalonia. And you're also a part-time assistant professor in the Future Everyday Cluster at the Department of Industrial Design, Eindhoven. And so Oscar's going to talk to us about living with and designing with plants through cohabitation. I'm very excited to hear the talk. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Before starting about talking about the topic that matters for all of you, which is this idea of living with and designing with through cohabitation, I'm going to slowly build up based on like the last 10 years of work that I've been doing in working with smart textiles and wearables. So let's start with that. Yeah. So when one thinks about like what it means to bring technology closer on the body, most of the times you might expect that it's just get something and put it on, and that's it, I'm done. This is, if I can imagine it, it should work. The reality is completely different. When we start exploring what it would mean to bring like light, vibration, and other kind of actuation in garments, we realize there's a lot of things that we need to take into account. So it's not just put it on and that's it. So, for example, like the things that we are wearing have multiple stable functions happening at the same time. So it helped me to see who I am. It helped me to see who I would like to be. It protects me from the cold, from the rain, changes my body shape, etc., etc. And all these things happen continuously and shift from one to another without, in a blink of an eye. So if you put something like mini LEDs on a textile, creating this kind of clouds, you won't expect that maybe the best would be to have a cloud around your neck. Well, the answer is no, because you can't control it at all. It's like having a Christmas tree on. I don't think any of you wants to have a Christmas tree. So we start exploring how we could control these lights, maybe by touch. So we could perform with the lights. But the answer in this case was that that was not an option either. Why? Because you can't feel the lights at all. You can feel what you're doing. So you need a mirror, or you need to look at others to see that your performance or your actions are meaningful for you and for the rest. We realize that it's really important to have this kind of personal involvement with the design process and explore how meaning is created through the interaction. So at the end, what started as some kind of light cloud ended up as some kind of vibratory self-care garment. And what we learned from this process is that we need to have this intimate connection with the technology that we are developing, not just at the lab, but on ourselves, and explore this connection from the day one, from when we are ideating, from when we are starting to prototype. I think I will just do it maybe with my hands. Did I do something wrong now? When we are prototyping, trying things like, and when we continue developing and exploring the way behavior, interaction, and meaning arises. then sometimes even like drawing becomes a way of documenting rather than a way of ideating or exploring. So in a way, this is what can be considered like embodied ideation. So the way that we can use our bodies, our senses, our possibilities as a way to explore, experience, feel, and transform things. But this requires specific knowledge about it. Like as any tool, as any methodology that we apply, it needs to be learned and you need to master it. So it's really interesting because when you think that you're going to use your body in the design process, most of the people think that that's because you can just feel it, give it shape, but it can help for a lot of different things. So first of all, I think it's really interesting to understand that you can use the body as a way of break with existing situations. So it can help to decontextualize specific use of an object or a material. It can help us to we can actually trigger new sensations by actively actuating things in different parts of our body to see how different ways of being can affect us. But also we can quickly change things ourselves and see how this changes our possibilities of moving and acting and so on. The kind of knowledge you can get from it, it's not just about the shape. It could also be a behavior, but it could be a new idea, a new concept. And I think that that's also something really important. But for me, when this kind of approach becomes really meaningful, it's when it's situated in context, when it's applied where you are expecting this thing to have, and hence my questions I was asking before. So over the years, I've been exploring, sorry, it's a bit. Yeah, the sound is not necessary there. So over the years, I've been exploring in different workshops and things what it means to ideate, explore, prototype, and use our bodies in the design process in context. So this is from a workshop I did in the Institute of Advanced Architecture a few years ago. The most interesting thing from it is that when we are just that like in a way multiple people used their bodies in a different way. And by comparing different projects, we found something quite interesting. So if you just focus on the material, I say that everything is possible. You can find millions of possible uses of what it could be, and every day will be a different one. So some kind of relaxation kind of garment will end up being a cocktail dress if we just focus on what it is and the way it works. When we involve our body and we understand the relation between our body and these materials, then there is a possibility that we forget everything that's around us. And we just focus on how the body supports this material or how the material allows us to become more aware of ourselves. So for example, like some kind of garment that was used to explore like the nitty-gritty things of nature, like the new flowers opening up, or the grain of sand that was on the floor, end up being some kind of musical instrument. So, because the context is so important and situating the design process is so important that I started exploring what it would mean these first-person perspective design interventions. So in a way, like how could we involve how can we think about the design action as a situated activity that happens as part of our lives, our context, the places that we are, and so on. And it mainly uses ourselves as a way to make sure that what we are working is at a human scale. The interesting thing about when you involve yourself in the design process is that multiple knowing bodies somehow are interacting continuously. So there is the knowing body, which is the way we feel, the way we are, how it relates to our identity, how it allows us to perform and be. And this is happening at the same time that we are exploring materials and so on. There is the crafting body. So if you are a designer, an architect, or I don't know, like a biologist, you are capable of creating things. But it's you, the same person, that is actually having these skills. If we combine ourselves, our life with the skills we have as a professional, I think that the possibilities are great. But also because we are part of a society, there is also the socio-political issues that are happening that become part of it. And I think it's really interesting to see that when we involve ourselves personally in the design process, all these knowing bodies merge in a tacit way during the process. So in a way, these first-person perspective design interventions are embodied and situated ways of acting, looking at things and ways of being involved. Ways of acting in terms of that the only thing you can do is what you're capable of doing, what you have been trained for, or what you somehow have learned over time. Also, and that's really interesting because we are not, when you do these kind of actions, you are not hypothesizing about what can be done. You are limited by the constraints of what you are, of who you are and what you can do. And that's really interesting to think in terms of that the resources we have in this world are limited. They are not endless. So working from the perspective of a limited amount of resources and skills allows to look at the design process in a completely different way. Also, if we look at things from our point of view, we'll be able to understand them from the perspective of an individual. And that helps us to attune to maybe relations with other entities that are not human. While if we look at things from above, from a model, from a simulation, we will never know if that dog that passes by there is chewing a carpet or something, or that it's stressed or something like this. And I think that these are the kind of things that we can see. It's also important to think that if you are the one carrying out the action, it's easier for you to feel responsible for the actions you do. Actually, you are able to respond to them because you know how you did it, you know what kind of impact it can have because you've experienced it, and you can act accordingly. And this is something really important. So I'm showing you just like a few videos of this simple kind of design intervention from myself where some kind of plan to explore what it will mean to have bio-duration, to actually put some fine smell on your hand, to understand how serious the smell could be differently if they would become a forest, or what would it mean to be for a day without touching any plastic and the implications it has for others. You'll see at the moment that she's actually forcing other people to give her things. So I think that simple actions like these ones allow you to understand power structures. It allows you to understand relations between humans and non-humans. It allows you to somehow explore what it will mean or what could be the impact of these things that you are dreaming or ideating. So in a way, first-person perspective design interventions relate to the past, the present, and future in a collaborative, generative, and performative manner. And why? Because it relates to yourself, to your history, to your memories, to your society, to your culture, but at the same time to your community and the people that you collaborate with. So involving yourself personally means at the same time involving you, your ancestors, the people you know, the people you work with in the design process. This is the work of Angela Mackey, and she was exploring what would be the future of dynamic fabric. And she did it by like a really simple trick, which is using a wearing green and using a chroma key app and somehow posting things on Instagram. So in Instagram, no one will realize what actually was that. It's all digital, right? But she was able to create a community. She was able to explore what it will mean to be hacked by someone else, because someone from behind started taking photos and putting other backgrounds on her. She was able to explore what kind of identity this kind of fabric needs to have in relation to herself, to be kind of the same for her, or what kind of company or fashion brand will be created out of it. And all by just involving herself in the process of exploring, ideating, and making. The interesting thing about involving yourself in the design process is that it's not just me, myself, and I with my things. So, as I said before, it just doesn't work at the scale of our bodies. It also works at the scale of the material flows. So we work what you have at hand, but what you have at hand, it's also what it might be produced there and what can be maybe recycled and reused in that place. It's also you interact, you focus on the interaction that happens besides the product that you are doing, but also with the technicians, with the people around, with the community that's behind the production. And that allows you to focus also on these kind of socio-technical systems of production. And at the same time, if multiple of you are collaborating in a project like this, the imprint that you can have in a city or in a region can be huge in terms of like transforming things from a bottom-up manner. Designing from a first-person perspective is not easy at all. It's super challenging. The first thing I already said, you need to work with the materials at hand, and not all of us are used to it. It's quite limiting. At the same time, it puts yourself at risk. You're putting yourself at the place where, in this place of not knowing, in this area that you are exploring, you make yourself vulnerable, but also be acting in a context where you might not be an expert yet, or where you just have a hunch or an idea, or even it can affect you personally in terms of your beliefs, your feelings, or your health. It's also difficult to commit to it because we tend to kind of separate ourselves from separate our professional practice from our personal practice. So in the last 5 years, I've been exploring what it will mean to change the way cities are. And I started by changing my flat. So I started exploring how like smart watering systems, smart lighting systems, smart humidity systems, and all kinds of things that you can imagine could help transform my living room in a temperate forest, my interior balcony into maybe like a rainforest, and the other rooms also in different kind of ecosystems. What I've been trying to do is try to document by photos and reflections this process as a way of exploring what it means to live with, at the same time that I'm designing with, in this case, plants. I think this is really interesting because the action of cohabitation, it's at the same time the goal, but at the same time the means to explore these new relations. So in a way, cohabitation as a form of first-person perspective adds to sustainability by approaching this idea of world making as a collaborative survival action through continuous engagement, attunement to everyday actions, and supporting expansion by means of growth and adaptation. So a lot of things have happened to my house in the last 5 years. You can see a bit the studio and the living room, how they change over time. So technologies change, plants grow, and all these things created, and COVID happened. So I can tell you that it was not easy to negotiate with my plants how much grow light they should have and how much time or how much headache I should get from it if I want them to grow properly. So I think it's really, really interesting to explore these negotiations that happen, this sharing of resources, but also understanding that nothing is stable and everything changes continuously. So whatever works today, the next day it's not going to work. I think in a way like this, living with and designing with through cohabitation as a form of first-person research allows to experience this hybridity that we see in our world. We try to separate our living systems from our man-made things, but it's all mixed, right? So this kind of nature culture, as Donna Haraway talks about it, it's what it is. And I think it's all what you are aiming for. But I think it's really important to unpack what it means, these new plant-human-computer interactions from a critical and ethical perspective. And I think that by living with them, it really, I was going to say a bad word, but you really you get it on your face. So these critical issues happen right away. So discussions I had with my system in terms of how much agency you give to a water pump. So how many plants will you have in one system? What if the internet goes away? It wouldn't be the first time that quite a few plants die because of this electricity shortcut and something resets. So I think it's really, really interesting to understand that a process like this allows you to experience with your own bodies, but also feel the implications of the technologies that you are developing that somehow you take for granted, but the answer is no. So cohabitation also allows to take a post-human approach to design by decentering the human of the design process and looking at it as looking at the design process as a relational infrastructural arrangement based on their interdependence and cooperation. So this is my interior balcony. I used to, as I said, it was some kind of tropical thing because it's full of orchids. The really interesting thing, it used to be my reading space with orchids, nice sun. I started without curtains because the curtains were like climbing plants behind. The interesting thing about it is that plants grow, as I said before, and I had to somehow design these kind of shelf systems as a way that every year they could almost double. And the question is like, how do you do this? And how many times do you need to rewire and unwire the whole thing? So I think it's really interesting to understand this as some kind of a way of infrastructuring, but some kind of agreements and negotiations that you have with them. And finally, I would say that the kind of multi-species collaborations emerging from cohabiting in an ecosystem can be considered some kind of a series of symbiotic encounters, sharing space and resources, allowing to work, and it allows us to work with nature from a bottom-up distributed and emerging perspective. So in the first photo, what you see is like the way that I build my grow lights, or I install my grow lights. It's based on all these kind of waste materials that I can find around. But also the interesting thing that by having other living things in your house, there's waste streams that I would never find use for that suddenly I can use for my plants. So that's really interesting. By having not just one species living in one place, but multiple ones, there are easier ways to reuse materials or even like find possibilities for them. From like tubes, I don't remember, I think maybe from some kind of construction thing that was happening, or like simple things like the rubber band that you have for the bread or the dry breads that you can actually use to put like the canes together to create some kind of support structure. It's really interesting. It's also really interesting to understand that you can create circularity not just with materials but also with this living thing. So I don't have flowers anymore. What I have is cuttings. So these are cuttings of the plants at the beginning that were so high they were touching the ceiling that I had to cut them and put them there. I normally don't cut any of the plants. I just move them around to find a place where they could be. That's also challenging, but there was a moment that I couldn't deal with it, and because I didn't want to throw them away. So then I'm starting to use them as decorative things, but at the same time they get the light and they get the humidity and temperature needed to root, so we can put them back in the pots later on. Another interesting thing is that these kind of collaborations sometimes add other elements. So I had like all kinds of spider mites, some kinds of flies, any kind of insect that you think that will that you don't want to be there, it's going to be there, but in large quantities. So there's also some kind of discussion in terms of what you're going to be doing. Are you going to let them be there? Are you going to just like wash them with water, or are you going to start some kind of biological warfare with predatory mites or other kind of things? So there is like a lot of discussions and a lot of things that happen in this process, but also a lot of new emerging things. Like in my balcony, no birds were there, but as soon as some other plants were around them, suddenly they start liking it a lot. So there is this emergent process of understanding what's happening. This is a process of becoming with all these different plants, but other animals that allows me to learn about it, but also be critical with my own self. So one would argue is like, if this is really cohabitation or slavery. I mean, I'm just putting plants in pots, and we all know now that they, as you all have explained before, they connect through mycelium and they talk with others and so on. So I'm just putting them in jail. It's literally a jail. A pot is a jail. So is that a way of doing it? On the other, you would say, well, but plants need pollinators, right? And maybe actually we've been used by them. Maybe we've been used by these philodendrons to expand all over. There is this book about like how grass has domesticated humans, right? So there's a lot of really interesting discussions that happen by just being there and being confronted with things that you didn't even imagine before. So that's all I wanted to say. And now that I'm here, I'm also gonna tell you that there's a new number on the Thema design, which is similarly it's about from personal well-being to planetary well-being. So I invite you also to have a look at it. Thank you.
Well, we have a little time for some questions. Anyone have a question for us?
Thank you. Really fascinating. And I loved your point about the pot at the end, because you also design within the field of products, right? Have you thought of designing a different system of indoor plant pots that could allow for mycelium to connect?
Yeah. So I haven't done it yet because that will mean transforming my house completely. But you could also think like it's like when you go to a gym, you know that sometimes they have these great structures on top of like a drainage system. So you could also think to have like a floor on top of a floor in your house. In this way, like you could have like a floor with soil on top of it where the roots can grow, and on top of that, you will have another floor or a structure where you can walk on. It's like when you go to a forest that they want to preserve the soil and they put these pots on. So maybe something like this, but that has quite a lot of implications. For example, with cleaning and dust. So I'm allergic to dust mites. You can imagine that having to handle plants at home is not really helping. So even like having a floor that you can clean or that it's difficult to clean will even make it worse. Or a floor that is mainly soil. Well, I don't even know. So I will need to check. I will start with one room first. The other thing is to look at walls in a different way, right? So we see a lot of people interested in doing plant walls, which I think there is one here. But normally it's mainly like a series of pots that are on the on a wall. You could also think you can use like climbing plants or plants that don't need soil to grow, and that could also be interesting, right? So you could explore other kinds of plants that don't need soil, therefore they don't connect in that way, as a way to explore these possibilities. And there's a lot of tropical plants that they are epiphytes, if I'm not saying it wrong, or that they just don't need soil to kind of grow. So, or they grow with soil first and then they kind of cut themselves from the ground so they can go up and up and up and up.
Have another question?
We've had a question on the chat, which I'll just read. So it's from John Makesh, and it says, great discussion on cohabitation with plants. As you touched on a little earlier about species, but I assume bugs and other animals would want to call your space home. Did you find these non-plant roommates to disturb your habitats? What did your friends and family think about the non-plant roommates?
Yeah, so this is a bit of like a love and hate relation. So yeah, I mean, you saw a spider before here. I think I have quite a lot of spiders at home. I even tried to put some other kind of predatory insects in so that they eat the other ones. And that creates a bit of a strange environment. I would say that the parts that are clean, that they don't have plants, they don't like that much to be there. So actually they have their own space. So it's a bit of like if you would have different rooms for different people. So you know that in that area, if you go in, for example, like let's say like the covered balcony, you know, if you go there, you might end up with some kind of bites. I don't know what, but something will bite you, and it's fine. You know that might happen. What The only problem is that I used to sit there to read, and I don't do it anymore. But I think that this is really interesting in terms of like somehow negotiating at some kind of simple basic level how you redistribute what's the interior of a house. So I'm not an interior designer, I'm not an architect, but somehow these kind of interactions that I'm having with the plants or with the bugs or the spiders or whatever is there, it's kind of shaping my house in a different way that it was, and at the same time shaping my behavior. So this kind of co-shaping that is created between them and me, I think it's quite interesting. And I'm not expecting everybody to live with the things they're designing. I think there are some things that are quite difficult, but I think it's really interesting in some cases to do so.
I think you've raised some really interesting questions from your first-person design, particularly thinking through how you how something like that first-person design can relate to more global infrastructures of how how materials move around the world. But also, I think it's fascinating the way you when you talked about the plants being enslaved, but in a way, you are also somehow becoming decentered in your own home, which I think is very interesting as well. Do we have any further questions? Okay, thank you very much. That was a fabulous presentation, Oscar. Thank you. And now I would like to invite to the stage Paula Nerlich. Paula is one of our researchers, Paula, I should say, I apologise, Paula, at the Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment. And Paula is a designer and explorer. Paula is a PhD candidate with us and is part of the project, the Living Textile Interface Group, which is led by Jane. And Paula is going to be talking to us today about her PhD, which is the materiality of well-being in the built environment, and also her project driving the human-bacteria interfaces.
Right, thank you so much, Louise, for the introduction. So I'm afraid I will not be talking about my PhD today. Please stay tuned and come by tomorrow. Today I will be talking about a collaborative endeavor. But first I would like to ask, what if we could design meaningful interactions between humans and the non-human within the everyday space of the built environment, focusing on mutualistic symbiotic modes of being. And I think that the former presentation touched on that quite a lot already. So today I'm presenting Human-Bacter Interfaces, designing for microbe-human interaction in more than human coexistence. And it's a collaboration with fellow researchers. We're all PhDs in our second year. So Anne-Sophie Belling, a creative technologist. We have Bea Delgado Corrales, who's our microbiologist, and then Romy Kaiser, who is part of the Living Textiles Research Group, and myself. So introducing the Ali prototype is our first prototype we created as part of a two-stage development process over 1.5 years, funded by a project called Driving the Human, which is based in Germany and run by 4 different institutions and supported by the German government. And as part of that, we developed for stage 1, which I'm presenting today, Ali, our first step towards our human-bacteria interface. So this human-bacteria interface, which we should call HBI, is a concept that examines multimodal interactions between humans and microbes and how it can elicit novel ways for humans to meaningfully collaborate and coexist with a non-human within the built environment. And specifically, these HBIs are tangible living interfaces consisting of microbial consortia that interact or respond to stimuli from the environment, emitting signals that are accessible to humans through our senses, such as touch, smell, and sight. And with our HBI, we explore designing through and with the other, encountering more than human realities to invite us to dive into new perspectives and to understand the other's needs, perception, possibilities and interaction, cohabitation. And by aiming for a multi-species and more than human perspective, we find that a new understanding of the other is nurtured, whether this be human, non-human, living, non-living, or whole ecosystems. And this allows to challenge current eco-social and political systems not only affect existence on Earth, but also humankind's journey beyond, and feeds new thinking into modes of multi-species cohabitation and negotiation between diverse agents. So, yeah. Okay, so just check. Yep, no, we're good, sorry. So in our HBI, the main non-human agents, as I mentioned, are microbes. And within our narrative, we aim to decenter human agents and allow for a disassembly of established narratives of bacteria and microbes as inherently bad or harmful in their existence to our human body existence and our health. And instead, we explore the complexity of this coexistence between humans and microbes. And we actually find that most of our body is bacteria. So we are more bacteria and microbes than human, actually. And in this, we emphasize human nature as a dynamic mode of becoming, always changing and sustained by its interaction and coexistence with microbial beings. We are breathing them in and out, and they're within our body, our gut, and on our skin and outside. And we're constantly in exchange externally and internally. And within this project, we seek to support a shift in our perceived relations with the other than human, a shift that foregrounds humankind's vital reliance on the more than human to survive, thrive, and carve out more equal, caring, and restorative futures. So at the heart of our interface concept is the idea of examining potential new relationships that I just touched upon and looking towards more symbiotic ways of living together. So our interdisciplinary approach, I always struggle with that word, weirdly, because it's part of my PhD, is very much shaped by our team. And our process includes exploring material design, creative technology, synthetic microbiology, and we utilize design and technology interventions as what we hope are meaningful ways to explore relationships with the more than human world. And we find that this challenges design and technology interventions. And it allows us through our different disciplines to approach this topic in diverse ways. And we find that especially conversations within the team, but also with people outside of the team, which we will see later, are really shaping this project. And sadly, we've not yet managed to also converse with our main agent, which are the microbes, but this is the journey that we work towards. So what if interfaces consisting of living microbial consortia could create an ambient living intelligence, which we call ALI, that responds to its human inhabitants and surroundings? So we envision this living sensory interface, and when ALI detects stimuli in its surroundings, it will respond by activating fluorescent proteins, resulting in an atmospheric glow, making an otherwise invisible interaction visible to the human cohabitant. And the ALI prototype was defined through these conversations, in which microbial organisms sensory and habitually engage with their surroundings. So looking at how we as humans encounter our environment and how do microbes and specific bacteria sense their environments. And I, as a designer, learned that they actually have diverse senses that are not unsimilar to our human ones as well. So this ambient living intelligent is imagined to encompass a continuum of diverse potential implementations within the habitats. But the alley that I'm presenting today for our team specifically focuses on using SCOBY, which is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, as a medium for HBIs to facilitate human microbial interaction through external stimuli and light. And this microbial matrix, we chose this because for our first stage, because we find it's fascinating. So it's created by these organisms, and it creates that we can't usually see with our eyes, right? Without technological help. And then it creates this matrix, this matter, the cellulose matter that we as humans can actually perceive and touch. So we envisioned in our first exhibition in last October that we would design, this is very blurry, I'm so sorry, but that we would design a SCOBY pellicle to then become this living sensor and react by emitting the light that I touched upon. And in this slide, actually, I feel like I'm talking about Bea's work, and luckily, yesterday there were quite a few experts already talking about this process of designing in the lab. So in the long term, and also please forgive me if I'm using sometimes the wrong terminology, but yeah, so in the long term, we would like Ali to react to a range of molecules and stimuli. And this includes a series of molecules that can be pollutants or stressors or other particles. And it might also be temperature responding or to changes in pH level. And as a proof of concept of this, our colleague Bea is currently designing a plasmid, which is an extra nuclear DNA fragment that contains an enzyme that produces color once it's reacting to a simple stimuli. So in our case, I believe it's sugar. And our experts from the Hub for Biotechnology, like Katie and Joshua, are in the audience, already shared some of the research yesterday. So I do hope it's okay if I just jump this. This is an example of what we are aiming for by our research colleague, Matt Rogan, who is also working with these visual stimuli to respond to certain elements and then advising him where to move forward into his research. So you see that the first stage that I'm sharing today, and I'm only sharing the first stage mostly because we are not yet allowed to share too much of the second stage. So we would ask you to stay tuned, and we're exhibiting in November in Berlin. So we will share more about that. But today, really, it's also about sharing how we as a team approach this, our values that we carry within this project, and also how this project has inspired some of our team members to explore the narratives in other settings than just in our 4-member team. So Romy Kaiser and I were invited to host the workshop Non-Human Design Lab at the Biodesign Lab in Karlsruhe at HFG as part of the Future of Life School. And there we invited students to explore interfacing with microbial species in different formats. And one being the bacterial cellulose spheres that are in the top image. I learned from Bea how to create spheres instead of pellicles, and I'm still so intrigued about them, how suddenly the shape might also inspire different design approaches. And we offered this to our students. One of our students is also in the audience today. You see her exploring the spheres right there and envisioning, could something be injected that could act as an interface sensor, or how could we reshape the whole sphere? Could we bind them together to become a larger interface? So Romy and I took them on a journey of design thinking and lab experimentation to explore these ways, to encounter the invisible microbial world and create imaginaries of how to interact and even communicate with the other than human, specifically focusing on bacteria. And the students were amazing and really inspired us as well. And the outcomes envisioned futures of coexistence and journeys of embodiment of microbial beings. And interfacing was studied through body heat, but also through body sense enhancing equipment, such as you see here. And the students managed to merge technology and the organisms they were offered. And by touching certain elements, the microscope that she's wearing got activated and would show her microscopic views of the other species. There were also students doing a whole performance, which was amazing, really celebrating being with the other. Sorry, I'm talking a lot about this workshop. So what are our next steps in our team? So at the moment, we are in the final months of the second stage, buzzing around, defining our scientific processes, finishing up, growing our bacterial cellulose and SCOBY. And we are also, during the whole process, constantly reflecting on how it is to work with the living and the ethical aspects of duties of care, accountability, and responsibility are connected to that. And Romy and I, as part of the Living Textiles Group, we are currently working on designing and constructing different modules with the schema that Romy shared about earlier on. And these modules will become a whole structure that will be part of the main experience, which you will see in a moment. We're also exploring different life support systems for our alley within different classes and hosted by textiles. So to round up this project, this is the journey that we will present in the next stage. So there we will take our visitors through different rooms in an experience, and we will take them from the present research state, from the macro scale, and invite them to dive into an actual video of going from the outside macro scale of the matrix of the bacterial cellulose into the inside, to then immerse themselves into the structure of the bacterial cellulose that you see here on the left. We will then take them to the next step, which is our near future. And here you see a slightly blurry, because we're not allowed to show too much, image of a textile structure that will resemble the bacterial cellulose and allow people to interact with the textiles and with the bacterial cellulose on site through body heat and interaction with the textile, and then activating certain responses. And then we will also show a film that will look into the far future, what we call the holobiont ecosystem, where we envision a completely new future of co-creating and cohabitating habitats with microbes and especially bacteria through textiles and bacterial cellulose producing bacteria. So let me invite you now to our first concept video. Or not. Yeah, it was just playing, so we're just gonna, no.
You should just go to the video.
Mm-hmm.
So see if you can get it to play, click on the video.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, tell you what, try.
It started already.
Oh, has it?
It's just very quiet.
Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go.
What if we could design meaningful interactions between humans and the non-human within the everyday space of the built environment, focusing on symbiotic modes of being? What if such symbiotic modes of being could materialize through living interfaces that act as an ambient living intelligence, responding to its human inhabitants and surroundings? Introducing the Human-Bacteria Interfaces concept, and the Ambient Living Interface, ALI. Human-bacteria interfaces are tangible, living interfaces consisting of microbial consortia that interact or respond to stimuli from their surroundings by emitting signals accessible to humans through touch, smell, and sight. The ALI interface uses SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, as a medium to facilitate human microbial interaction through external stimuli. The bacteria embedded in the SCOBY will be biotechnologically designed to translate stimuli into signals that are accessible to humans. When ALI detects stimuli in its surroundings, it will respond by activating fluorescent proteins, resulting in an atmospheric glow, making an otherwise invisible interaction visible to the human inhabitant. Embedded in the cellulose structure of bacterial origin, the SCOBY microbial mix forms a jelly-like texture, which provides a large-scale human-bacteria interface for the built environment. The bacteria embedded in the SCOBY matrix can be designed with biotechnology to react to a variety of molecules, such as pollutants, stressors, and stimuli such as heat, allowing for an array of implementations within the context of the built environment. Through the ALI interface, novel symbiotic relations between humans and microbial life are explored. Instead of perpetuating antimicrobial narratives, human nature is examined through its vital entanglements with the non-human microbial world, together transfiguring the metabolic landscapes of the built environment, as futures of eco-social renewal are examined through encounters with the microbial sphere. Join us in our vision of microbial futures.
Yeah, hashtag microbial futures. So yes, thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you, of course, to Driving the Human, our funders. They're very kind. But also a big thank you to the Hub for Biotechnology, to our supervisors, to the whole research group, to Josh, who's in the audience, who's our advisor, to Jasmine Bird, and then to our helpers, so Eileen Hunelo, Matt Crown, Chris Miller, and also the architecture workshop team, which is led by Oliver Perry, who's very patient with the chaos of textiles and boxes and stuff that is emerging in the workshops. So yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Paula. That was a fascinating presentation as ever, and I would like to see if anyone would like to ask a question.
I just wondered, what happens if Ali gets a taste for all the other bacterial influences around it? I'm going to call it it. You know, if you're going to put it into public places or anywhere, and there's hot, sweaty bodies around full of bacteria, buildings full of bacteria, is it going to change and lose stability? Or, I mean, what controls do you have over it?
So, Ali, the glowing test is still in development in the lab, and we're also not leave the lab because we are exhibiting in Germany, and no GMO is allowed in open public exhibitions. So it will stay safe in the lab, and we will film it and then show that part in the exhibition. And for our stage 1, we use SCOBY on site, and like for me, that's still a very new organism to also work with, but it was amazingly stable, and it's not only survived the exhibition and the change of air microbiome, but also humans actually touching it. However, the pieces that were touched and explored, we disposed of later because contamination is a big issue. So we initially thought of, when we had this amazing idea of maybe having like a bacterial cellulose growing out of something, rolling down and for us to really immerse with it, make it like a touching sensor, but understanding the needs of the other allowed us to say, okay, maybe we need to put protection in place, because what we as human designers want might not be what is best for the other organism.
And vice
Yeah.
versa. And vice versa.
And that, yeah, of course, yes, also encountered. It's an exchange.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering sort of limited ways of exploring self-illness, a bit in the way of the previous speaker. So self like illness and self. So rather than using cellulose, so different ways of representing your own illness for the people to interact with
It cannot be Cecily and ask you to rephrase it. So illness within me.
For instance, the previous speaker spoke about taking it onto the oneself to explore, in his case, design elements.
Yeah.
So I was thinking in this case, you know, we interact with bacteria sometimes through illness. So then a different way of representing the bacterial cell involved in hospitals, you've got machines and all sorts of things. This could be an innovative way of finding. I wondered if you had thought about exploring that on a personal level in the environment of the body.
I guess I would find this self-test a bit scary. And I'm not sure if I want to be the interface. I might be already to many organisms, but I would not want to induce myself with potentially harmful organisms. I'm too selfish for that, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's interesting, like where do we start to think of what is cohabitation, coexistence? And really, I think what we are doing is just we are rethinking what already exists, because we are already cohabitating with them. Only these are not topics that are openly explored in the design, art, and science world, and it allows us to maybe envision other futures, but really often we find it's already happening, or the only way to do it, to ingest it, would harm myself so much that it wouldn't be a cohabitation after all.
Cellular, because meaning in terms of illness.
Oh, I
The way
see.
we
Oh, yeah.
integrate illness,
Yeah.
you see yourself as an experiment, so because one gets ill anyway.
Yeah.
And seeing it rather than a negative, you're thinking about it be an exploration in different forms to interact with that system to make it bigger.
Yeah.
More informed.
So maybe I could just share one of the teams at the summer school workshop. They actually decided that they wanted to look at how the bacteriocellulose could, or the SCORBY could support our gut microbiome. And they decided to go through different processes of preparing it raw and cooked and ingesting it. It was quite yummy.
Yeah, I like the idea of us becoming the alley, which I think is, that's interesting. So we have another question from the audience.
We've got a question online, which I'll read out for you, Paula. So it says, fascinating presentation. I'm curious in terms of co-creating element with the bacteria. How is the perspective of bacteria influenced the design and concept of the interface?
How did the bacteria, can you just repeat that? Sorry.
How did, so it says,
How do the perspective of bacteria influence the design?
yeah, so in terms of co-creating element within the bacteria, so in terms of co-creating element with the bacteria, how is the perspective of bacteria influenced the design and concept of the interface?
Yes, I guess I briefly touched on that regarding Helen's question. How do we as humans imagine an interface, and how would we want to interact? First, we wanted to have a touch interaction, and then actually looking at the perspective of the bacteria, found out it would be harmful to the other. So that was one step. And then the perspective of the bacteria also regarding the bacteriocellulose, which is part of our journey that we take the exhibition visitors onto, which has a big impact on the final design look later on. So yeah, definitely, it has had an influence.
I just would like to build as well, because I think it's actually a really good question, also a challenge we were facing actually during the process, because we're talking about collaborating and cohabitating, but then you actually realize in the process what does that actually want. Like it's hard to actually get the perspective, and in the end, then we still need to guess out of our perspective what it is. So we also have this question: how would it be to live with the living surrounding out of our perspective, but also what does need the organism to thrive? So that really brought us also to the point of trying to get bioreactor more accessible, more open and fulfilled as well. However, it's a journey, and I think it's one of these questions where we all kind of struggle with at the moment to try to address, and raising awareness about it and discussing it. Perhaps already is a step forward.
Yeah, indeed. And I think one thing that I would really love to explore more or read about more is like, how can we actually move away from our human-centered perspective? I'm not sure if anyone in the audience has an idea on that. I'd be really curious to hear it.
But touching on the previous question about us being an ally, we are already an ally, isn't it? Like all the skin, everything. So I was just curious whether you wanna touch and introduce it during your presentations, because now there are also people associating bacteria as sickness, illness there that was, but obviously it's not. And there are much more good bacteria, and actually if we have the good bacteria, they can fight the bad ones. So are you planning to somehow incorporate this knowledge and propagate this knowledge to people when they come to your exhibition?
We have decided to not completely focus on. We would love to immerse people in a optimistic future view of new building and a new home, just because we are from the Hub for Biotechnology in the built environment. But this topic of exploring the other and its qualities and potential societal preconceptions will be one element of a workshop that is also offered on the site. So our colleague Bea will offer a workshop running during the exhibition, which actually we were asked to call experience, during the experience, where she will look into bioreactor design, but also engage people in this topic. Because it's also a big part, I think, of her PhD research. And also we found that these conversations also naturally came up in the last exhibition. And I'm really looking forward to having more conversations with people and hearing of their perspectives also about GMO and so on. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think the thing that you said about the question about how you can ever move beyond the human perspective is a really pertinent one, because obviously we all are humans and you can't possibly put yourself entirely in the shoes of another species. And I think that's something that's worth all of us bearing in mind as we make and try to coexist with other species in the world, which I think is a really important thing to ponder and reflect on. Thank you very much, Paula. That was fascinating. Thank you. And do we have our next speaker with us? We have, we have James Forren, who is Associate Professor and Director of the School of Architecture at Dalhousie University. And James is working on a project which he's going to introduce to us, the investigation of living building materials. Oh, my mic has just died in that moment. reduce farming and construction impacts. And the ambition of the project is to produce building materials from the waste streams of other environmentally intensive industries. So this should be really interesting to learn about. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yep, so hi, I'm James. And in the bio, it kind of lists the different people involved in this project. But they're all listed here as well. And so the project is going to describe largely a collaboration between my architecture lab and a oceanography lab. But I'm coming from a practice perspective, and I just wanted to kind of make this larger connection to architecture and textiles because it had been mentioned before, and this has been a really great session to be a part of, helping me think through a lot of issues I've been trying to get my head around. So these are projects that I've been involved in that kind of function at this kind of large scale textiles interface. And this one in particular is relevant to this discussion because it's talking about the structuring of human relationships through materials. So all materials are locally sourced there for this structure. It was kind of almost like a cottage industry construction that was kind of, someone mentioned earlier, redistributing these sort of centralized capitalist concentration of wealth into more localized economies. So this was a project where we intentionally sought to do that. But I'm not going to be talking about these architectural projects. I'm just trying to put in context some of the stuff that's going to be coming later. So during my research position at Lousie, I've largely been involved with a industry group in concrete and looking at different technologies to, I would say, gradually lighten concrete construction. So this is maybe a familiar methodology that we've seen. Just a kind of note on here, we did use AR for conceiving and making this sort of link between the digital and the physical. No drawings were produced for this project, using components there. And I do have some thoughts on the discussion around AR in construction. There is actually a way to think about it in a more democratizing way. There are ways that in my discussions with colleagues in human-computer interaction can talk about people who are on the floor, maybe using the AR interface to actually send information back to a central model. Likewise, in my conversations with people in industry, they're finding that a lot of their laborers don't read drawings very well, but they read computer programs very well. So the AR interface actually, I think, has some promise in that area. But we're looking at climate change impacts. So I think someone else had already referenced the kind of impacts of building materials on greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a really great text. I would recommend anyone look it up. It's an engineer in British Columbia, and they're looking. His argument, it's an interesting one, that if we think about this 11%, this is an engine. This is an engine of harm, climate harm. But can that 11% be changed into an engine of climate repair? You think about the bulk mass of material. Can we think of architecture as a massive carbon sink? He argues that you can actually reverse temperature, climb through that, and actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So something to think about. Other discussions, we're talking about what are our kind of levers for actually enacting change in industry. So in the university, we're suddenly getting calls from people in construction industries saying, oh, the government's requiring us to be net zero by 2050, but they're not telling us what that means or what's defined that. So can you help us? So really, government is a big driver in this. When we started to think about concrete and thinking about how it can be more of a kind of climate friend, possibly, and this is artificial rocks coming from that Bruce King, text where he thinks about concrete construction as a practice, as a sense of artificial rock, just basically gravel and glue, a binder and an aggregate. And so once you break open the case there in a way, what are the different ingredients you can start to mix in? So we looked at biochar, thermochemically converted biomass. I won't go into too many details with that, but we've been able to connect with called a biochar importer. They're trying to license the technology in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has a major biomass economy. They have a biomass problem because they were shipping a lot of their forestry waste to a pulp mill that has since closed down. So we're trying to assist that industry partner in kind of launching that technology. But for anyone not familiar with biochar, there's different processes that you can produce it through. One's a wet process, one's a dry process. But it's basically the byproduct of this thermal conversion. So you're basically left with a kind of carbon byproduct in a carbon-based powder. So we've been in this collaboration with chemical engineering, but also with oceanography. Our oceanographer partner, Hugh McIntyre, has been working closely with Sophia who's been generating the conversion processes, and he's been looking at different byproduct uses for those byproducts. So we've been looking at the biochar in concretes. This is a demonstrator that we developed with a mix that we were experimenting with, and we wanted to test it in the field with our kind of industry partners assisting it. So this is an alignment structure, which is actually a community resource, which is people use for kind of these celestial events with the community. So it aligns with Solar North. But really this started this whole thinking for me and rethinking my way of working around this idea of feedstock conversion and utilization. So how can we look at industries in a kind of flywheel effect? So like the waste, so like right now they're operating in silos, you're extracting materials that you're extracting are getting harder to find. So you're having like more climate harm from that. And then they're getting just, thrown into landfill. And then that's also happening in agriculture, in fuels, and all these different industries are doing the same thing. But they're generating all this waste and byproducts. So people have already mentioned agriculture waste and ways of recirculating waste. So we're just kind of curious about participating in that. And these are the different sorts of streams that we kind of speculated on in roadmaps. So again, this is just kind of coming back to how do we structure human interactions through materials. This is the kind of beautiful mind diagram that I worked out with you to try to understand. I don't know if he's listening, but he talks very quickly and says very intelligent things in a very condensed way. And I'm just, wow, this is insane. And my research assistant, Laura Nolfi, who made this connection with you, she really got it as well. And so we'd be talking and be like, is this how it works? Is this how it works? So I actually sat down with a preliminary map, and then Hugh kind of edited it. But this basically shows these kind of flows that we're thinking about, where you have feedstocks on the left, utilizations on the right, conversions happening in the middle. And what's really neat about biochar is that you use all these different waste streams. And then through those conversion processes, we're getting different types of byproducts and using them in different applications, or conceiving of using them in different applications. So these are slides that Hugh put together. I'm going to do my best to try and interpret them. And he came up with this idea of waste to feed in food and fabric being building materials, and kind of like that. So I think the basic gist of this, one of the things that that's come up in our discussions is high quality versus low quality waste streams. So basically, a lot of his work is in kind of food and supplements and other kinds of high grade byproducts. So you don't necessarily want to use those high grade byproducts in building materials. But he's also, our initial conversation was around the use of bacteria to clean up coastal waterways. So I have heavy metals or fertilizer runoff. And the problem he was faced with was like, well, I have all this dirty bacteria now. Where do I put it? One thought is like, well, maybe we can start to sequester it because it suddenly becomes a low-grade material. Maybe we can start to sequester it in building materials. Raises its own kind of set of problems potentially. If you're sequestering toxic matter in a building material, how do you manage that? So those are some questions that we're answering, or looking at, not necessarily answering right now. But the gist of this slide is we're getting a kind of double use out of, in this case, what's the aqueous phase of the hydrothermal liquefaction. And so the bacteria is basically eating up initial nutrients. So there's nitrogen is one of the nutrients, and then you're left with further nutrients out of that phytoplankton culture, which can then be used for fungal growth. And in both of these kind of products coming out of here, the bacteria or the fungi can be used in building materials, can also be used in for fish feed. And so again, in that model, we're using salt water, so we're not competing with freshwater growth. And we're using the bacteria, or sorry, the phytoplankton are not competing with land-based organics. So this slide as well is kind of talking about, I guess I'd say the different uses of the aqueous phase, where with introducing one type of strain, you're actually getting a lower yield. And so these are very useful acids in Hughes' world. But with a different strain, so this is again byproduct from this transformation process and the growth process that we're then feeding back into architectural products. You're actually getting an increased yield with this other organism. And so those are useful byproducts in health and nutrition. And then coming back, so I'm really, this has been a great mycelium celebration here for me. This is just totally new territory for me. So I'm really excited to see the amazing work that's being done around this species or fungi. So what we've also discovered is that, or what Hughes discovered is that we'll call it dissolved organic nitrogen is actually a really good growth medium for the fungi as well. So we're looking at this as another sort of, as people have shown, another ingredient for building materials. So our kind of most tangible connection to this discussion here is this phytoplankton specimen in sand and gelatin block that we've developed and tested. And this is based on a paper by Forren is the kind of lead author on that paper. And so we're really trying to recreate that experiment, but with this particular bacteria strain and with a different biopolymer. So we're using gelatin with a coarse grained sand. This is just a kind of simple diagram for describing the steps. So one of the challenges that we are faced with this is that the gelatin wants to, starts to harden and become less able to mix at this kind of 33-degree mark. But the phytoplankton don't want to be brought up to a higher temperature than 26 degrees. So there was a sort of like happy moment where you could kind of mix everything together, but that's a sort of a troublesome match. So we're hoping to find other kind of mixtures there and have other candidates to work through. So these are just photographs of the same kind of sequence of events. Preliminary testing that we did on these specimens. So these are all just proof of concept. I'm not making any great claims to what these materials do. But these are the controlled specimens. This black line is one of the biotic specimens. And so this is a strength diagram and looking at when the specimen basically fails and then as it kind of crushes. And then these higher strength specimens I'll talk about in the next slide, and I'll probably flip back to this slide to talk about the behavior. But just the one thing to note is that the blue lines were developed under different curing conditions, but these from here to here we saw a 40% increase in strength from the introduction of the bacteria, which are basically acting as a strengthening agent. So our hypothesis as to why those other specimens were so much stronger is we didn't have a controlled, we did measure the temperature and humidity, but we didn't control it. And so the curing conditions were much drier and cooler for those stronger specimens. So we'd like to recreate that experiment and see if we get better compressive strength out of those. But the other thing that was interesting with it is, so these are the kind of abiotic specimens. This is the biotic specimen. You can see there's a little bit of a crush there. So these abiotic specimens, they basically fractured, but the biotic specimens kind of compressed more like a pancake. So the speculation there is that the phytoplankton were also operating as a kind of fiber matrix within that matrix. So that's also, if you look at this stress strain, you can see that they kind of hang on for quite some time and kind of level out at a higher strength. Coming back to the biochar, so one of the kind of ideas here, if we think back to that earlier kind of beautiful mind slide, is that, okay, we can get this carbon drawdown biomass with the biochar, we can get this kind of cleaned up waterway with the phytoplankton, we can combine them, and so we can start making potentially building materials that are really doing some climate repair with their production, because obviously sand has problems with it. So we're again a long way off from figuring out many of these things, but we did start to look again at because one of the things we wanted to test too with the biochar is we found that with the concrete, it wanted to have some saturation level, because otherwise it starts to suck all the water out of the concrete. So we just tested that out with this process as well. The pre-soak char was a little bit weaker. Another just kind of interesting sidebar with the concrete in biochar. So there are some researchers in Poland doing a similar study with the material, and they found that the freeze-thaw performance of the concrete was actually improved. And our collaborator in civil engineering speculated that because the char is quite porous, so it absorbs water and swells up. As the concrete hydrates, that char loses water and starts to shrink. And so actually it might form little air pockets within the concrete. So it's almost like a natural air entrainment material. We'd like to move this into the additive manufacturing world, looking at with the kind of, we'll call them bio slurries. Right now we're kind of just, again, I would say gearing up on the additive manufacturing workflow. This is an earlier test with the biochar. So we wanted to see how much of the biochar could we work into a clay slurry. And so we got up to about 50% on this. So we were quite pleased with that outcome. Coming back to the curing conditions, we're making a specimen curing box to control the temperature and humidity. These are some drawings that were done recently. So just to kind of wrap up some of our preliminary findings on all this work. So we're successfully growing biomass feedstock on food production effluents. And we found suitable candidates for the microcalcite precipitation and some proof of concept test data. One thing I would add is right now we're importing the phytoplankton strains. A further step in this, might be in the next slide, is to do what Hugh refers to as bioprospecting. So actually finding local candidates to work within. So the whole idea is to work locally with these, but we're doing proof of concepts. He was very adamant, of course, that we do not release any of these imported bacteria into the landscape. But one of the things about these bricks, if you haven't looked at this kind of process before, is that within that humidity gradient, you can actually break open the brick and make new bricks while the humidity is high. And then when you drop the humidity, that's when the phytoplankton die off, and that's when they calcify, and that's when they become like a strengthening agent as opposed to a regenerative agent. And and there are some, I think, ethical questions that we have to think about too with that process, because they are living organisms that we're working with. We've also demonstrated in Hugh's lab the terrestrial fungi in waste emitted seawater, and finally the clay slurry toolpath production. So a whole host of kind of things we'd like to do. So because we've been challenged with the gelatin, we've also been using alginates with these mixtures, also with some limited with some success, but dimensional stability problems. A hypothesis that the xanthan gum would be a better agent to develop these composites with. So again, I mentioned the bioprospecting. adapting to additive manufacturing. One of the things that we're, maybe I didn't talk about with the biochar, we did test thermal properties and such, and that there are these kind of architectural properties of the materials that we actually need to explore on a design basis. Optimize the photosynthesis, I'm going to read that one, in heterotrophic cultivation to maximize the remediation of the waste streams and to optimize the mechanical design properties of LBM. So really tuning that relationship between the feedstocks and the utilization as a building material. So, architecturally thinking about the human behavior and response. So in that earlier slide, I did have 2 brackets there that were community. I'll just, I've gone to 20, I'm sorry. I'll just go back to this really quick because it's an important thing. So community happens here, community happens there. We've partnered with a sociologist who has started to develop a kind of toolkit for engaging with communities who are impacted by resource economies, communities who might adopt any types of architecture into their world. And these resource economies can be harmful, but they can also be regenerative for communities. And so I think thoughtful engagement with on that front is important. So yeah, and I think that's it. So thanks to different participants in the projects and the different funders and supporters. And thank you.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. A lot to
I know.
think about. A lot to think about. Does anybody have any questions after that? We do.
So I was just wondering what actual biomass you're using from forestry, because I know the conservation charity that was working with this every year, they're currently working on a biochar project.
Yeah.
But utilizing invasive rhododendron for their forestry.
Yeah.
But they're developing like cultural projects about using the biochar for like art installations and stuff. But I was just wondering.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's a really good question.
In the forest, what?
Yeah.
Not just trees, like what other species are being used for that?
Yes. So the particular char that we used, we did 2 tests. One was with a natural building community group, client, essentially. They were where we built that. They were doing biochar kind of at the cottage industry level on site, Japanese knotweed, but for exploring this kind of industrial process, this company, RDA Atlantic, who are licensing this technology in Poland, they partner with lumber mills. So this is kind of so the product that we use is little transparency was actually imported. That product, so that company in Poland, we imported that to Nova Scotia, or they imported that to Nova Scotia as they're trying to kind of promote this technology so they can license it in Nova Scotia. And the species, we've gone back and forth on this, but it's like I want to say a spruce fir mix of some kind going into those that char. That particular char. And then the lumber mill, they have a lumber mill in Nova Scotia that they're partnered with, and I think we're looking again at spruce fir.
I wanted to dive in there actually and relate that to your question, your slide on the community, and perhaps maybe there are other ways in which you're involving community in some of those kinds of decisions around the materials that you use.
So right now, I would say that involvement is more aspirational than, so the deanery are kind of deep community not-for-profit. So all their work is community-based. The RDA is a company that we're working with. And then the sociology piece of this research cluster is at this kind of toolkit level. I guess what I would say is our aspirations there were, so one of the aspirations is there's a kind of aquaculture industry in Nova Scotia that has there's off-land or in-water aquaculture, and that's really harmful. And then they're trying to encourage on-land farming. But that is meeting resistance. It's not highly incentivized. And there are, there are indigenous communities within the province who are connected to that industry. And so one of the, there's an organization called the Cities Environment Unit. They've worked on kind of indigenous community planning charter that's been adopted by Nova Scotia and has worked with multiple communities in the province. So they're well aware of kind of the issues around community engagement with these technologies, with any kind of project. So we've been working with them in a kind of advisory capacity, and really the discussion has been, you really got to have your ducks in a row to kind of engage fulsomely in that. And when we're really at kind of very early stages on that process. But I would say the aquaculture, to go back to the feedstock question, the aquaculture feedstock is another, aquaculture waste feedstock is another kind of byproduct that we're looking at. And that's and so Hugh's actually working with that in the lab, but we're not with an actual aquaculture producer. Sorry, that's a roundabout. Yeah.
I just jumped into that.
No, it's a good question. No, it's a really good question.
Anybody else have a- Thanks, James, for nice talk. Have you measured the CO2 sequestration properties of the slurry?
No, it's good. Yeah, Laura has. Laura's reported back to me on it, and I couldn't find that data. It was positive, but I'm not going to get up here and I mean it's hand waving right now. I can dig that up. But what we measured it on were the columns that we built. So we did a kind of inventory of the volume. Also, full disclosure on the columns, I didn't describe this, that the core is actually traditional concrete, conventional concrete. The foundation actually has carbon pure CO2 sequestration. If anyone knows about carbon pure, in that, but the anyway, so there's kind of a crust of the 100% biochar mix around it. But the offsets were significant in that it's bulked up. It's a lot of biochar in that. But sorry, I don't have the actual numbers. Yeah. It's the right question.
Okay, any other questions? Well, in that case, I'd like to thank James very much for joining us. Thank you.
Yep.
And now I'd like to welcome, I think last presentation, but by absolute no means least for today, Thora Arnardottir, who is from our Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment. Thora is a multidisciplinary research designer who focuses on the integration of biological systems in the built environment through design methods and innovative biofabrication techniques. And in 2017, she co-founded the collective BioBabes, which you're going to hear a little bit about now. An experimental design and research group that focuses on the exploration of biodesign through interactive devices and wearables. And I think you're also going to hear about one of those projects in particular, Future Wardrobe. So I'll hand over to Thora. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Thora. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do with BioBabes. So in 2017, I founded a collective called BioBabes, which is an international collective of feminist makers, architects, and designers. That's fine. Kind of engaged in the redesign of relations and interactions with our living environment. And today I'm going to be talking about a few of the kind of wearable projects that we've kind of made together, which is quite different from my usual work here at the Hub, and it's a bit more on the speculative side. Okay, so just a bit of a background from our group. We're a collective working on different kind of biomaterials and biofabrication methods. We work internationally, both independently and as a group. And by operating in this way, we can reach a wider audience and collaborate with different designers, scientists, makers, and local industries to develop kind of our shared aims. So at the center of our practice is collaboration. And just like in nature, it's a symbiotic relationship with others, whether they're human or non-human. We collaborate to envisage how we can kind of shift design thinking and public mindset to a more human microorganism symbiosis. And we kind of consider our work to be bio-centric, and we look at exploring kind of how biological interactions affect our design experiences. And what I mean by that is that we don't actually look at them as just materials or resources, but actually as active contributors to kind of guide the form and the shaping of the whole system that's around them. So our first project we actually worked on as a group was the Living Light project. And we looked at the symbiotic relationship between the Hawaiian bobtail squid and Vibrio fishery, which is a bioluminescent bacteria. So these have kind of evolved to work together in a mutually beneficial way. So the squid basically needs the bacteria to hide in plain sight from predators in the water, and it mimics kind of a moonlight. And the bacteria needs an environment to grow and multiply in. So this bacteria is housed in the light organ of the squid. And what happens basically is during the day, this is a simplified version, but during the day, the squid kind of ejects the bacteria out, so the younger squids can kind of pick it up and include it into, or capture it into their light organ. And we really love this idea of symbiosis and of the two organisms working together in such a beautiful way. So this inspired us to think if we can create our own light organ to nurture and house this bioluminescent bacteria. So we looked into the growth, the morphology of the culture, and kind of how the way the bacteria communicated through quorum sensing. Ooh. And like,
so it seems like this is loose. 2 seconds. It's survived this long.
It's okay.
Right. I'm just going to move this to the right slightly. Sorry, Thora.
No worries.
Share screen. Desktop 2. That. Is it on?
Okay. Like most of our projects now, we constructed a DIY incubator box to kind of house the bacteria and keep the optimum conditions for it to grow. So it was equipped with sensors, and the light blocking kind of incubator was able to monitor the temperature and humidity, and we were able to cool the box down and kind of keep them okay for this growing phase. Inside, we had glass Petri plates that were growing on pedestals. They were able to view from the openings in the top in an otherwise completely dark space, because the light that they actually make is quite faint, so it's difficult to see. As you can see here, there are quite a lot of other organisms growing. Obviously, we had not mastered the aseptic technique at all, but it allowed us to kind of observe and see how they are communicating or how they're growing with other organisms. Now, in order to provide a better sterile environment that would still allow us to kind of engage with this bioluminescent matter, we designed glass pieces to house the bacteria and to minimize the contamination. So we had these tiny tentacles that reached out and allowed hot air to rise and come out of the glass. And then we had other tentacles that kind of allowed fresh air to come in and it minimized kind of the risk of contamination, but housed them in this vessel. Now, these pieces were then placed in a wearable silicone that protected them basically from the heat of the human body. And we wanted to utilize this kind of biological light giver on our bodies, carrying and nurturing these microorganisms in return for their light. And we were quite lucky to be exhibited at Expo 2017 in this kind of beautiful bioluminescent hut designed by Ecologic Studio in London. So moving on to our project BioWare, where we worked with slime molds, whose habitat has been kind of redesigned in these wearable glass pieces again, but as jewelry. So in this project, glass is a key part that is used to alter the perception that we have of a living organism, which are often perceived as gross or unclean in our sterile kind of indoor environment. So these glass pieces offer us a closeness to the organism and allow us to observe and monitor the movement and behavior. Alongside the pieces, we created a toolkit which allowed the wearer to care for the organism in the comfort of their own home, providing a range of tools and equipment that would maintain a sterile environment, inoculating and cleaning tools, nutrients to sustain the organism, and instruction for care. Now, once the life cycle of the organism has been fulfilled within the glass piece, the user is able to remove any inanimate material and start the process again, permitting kind of ever-evolving wearable device. And with these pieces, we're kind of aiming to encourage more persistent and interactive attention to nature. The time, the energy, and conditions kind of given to these organisms will directly affect their behavior, and therefore the formations that they actually provide within the vessel. So the more care and attention to its needs, the more elaborate the designs, making this collaboration between the organism and the wearer. So with BioWare, we're proposing to alter the human perspective. We aim to foster a practice of interaction and therefore care towards developing a symbiotic relationship with a non-human organism. So the approach to nature entails a change of rhythm from the kind of hyper-speed production to a slower pace that tries to synchronize human activity with the natural environment. And then we can call a lot of reflection and production of relationship. My mouth is getting very dry. Which then leads me on to our kind of most recently finished project, Future Wardrobe, which received funding to design and fabricate a living garment that was able to host living algae in these liquid chambers. So we partnered up on this project with Laura and Catherine, who are textile artists and material researchers, to highlight kind of through our wardrobe the need to reestablish this connection to nature in the sense of mutual care by adopting design principles that we would like to say put the planet first. So Future Wardrobe focuses on living garments for interspecies connection and combines biomaterials, biotechnology, and living cultures. And with this project, we speculate on a future where our wardrobe incorporates habitable spaces for non-human organisms, in this case, microalgae. The project is kind of a critical reflection on the devastation imposed by the malpractices in the textile industry. And as designers, we believe we have kind of a responsibility to meet the needs of both of the human and the non-human organism. Now, through our kind of previous projects, as well as this one, we've been asking ourselves questions regarding kind of our collaborative nature with the microorganisms. What is interspecies collaboration? How do we shift from an anthropocentric to biocentric design? And can we consider algae our non-human client? So this shift from anthropocentric to biocentric design happens as we work with the living algae and approach them not just as a resource, but as a non-human client from whom we structure our design methods to accommodate the nurturing of its needs. And for this project, we wanted to look at algae as our client in the design process, cater to their well-being and advocate for their voice. So in the beginning of our design process, we kind of reflected on the possibility to collaborate rather than just using the microalgae as a dead material. And we asked ourselves, how can we design for our needs and the needs of the algae? So we took steps towards a kind of a different approach of engagement medium in the design process. So we chose algae because they're one of our oldest ancestors. By providing oxygen, they made our atmosphere livable. And we wanted to give the algae the platform they deserve. To house our algae, we designed alternate pouches to form part of the wearable piece. And by using a special imaging technique, PAM, we were able to capture the photosynthetic energy from the microalgae that we use to kind of sense the well-being of the algae and better understand how we could, how some of the culture would be affected by the materials that we're putting them in. We started from a materials exploration, focusing on using only non-toxic and compostable ingredients for our bioplastic sheets, yarns, and dyes. These are all based on various forms of algae, from kelp to spirulina, that are processed through custom-made machines and tools that we created to work with this material to extrude and spin the alginate-based yarn that informed our shape, color, and aesthetics. The material that we're creating or working with is water repellent, is biodegradable, and can be strengthened through additives such as organic fibers. And to incorporate these pouches into the wardrobe, we designed coral pieces that hold them safely on the shoulders of the human wearer. The placement of the pouches allows the algae to receive sunlight and agitation. But for us, it's also this kind of closeness between the two species. The wearer can kind of sense, can touch, and actually kind of smell the algae, and the algae can feel the movement and the touch of the wearer. And to kind of enhance this closeness, we developed biowearable electronics in a kind of speculative medium of communication between the species. So we created these different kind of sonar soundscapes by translating the changes in conductivity of the algae to vocalize the activity in real time. And we're using this kind of element to listen, to record, and to kind of involve our ways of interpreting their sound. So I have a little clip here of. So the 6 final pieces that we created for the wardrobe combined various manufacturing techniques such as digital fabrication, extrusion, weaving, and patchwork. The main cape was created by casting our biomaterial with the colors, textures, and movement that kind of give an homage to the underwater world. The top neck piece and skirt used extruded bio yarn that were woven on the custom-made loom. And our algae pouches were cast in custom-made molds, and the coral structure was 3D printed. And just to kind of end the talk and kind of end the day almost, I wanted to share with you kind of our concept video that we created for the project, which is focused on algal recruitment of us as the human host to advocate for the algae, showcase them and their importance for our survival. Yeah, that was kind of it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an incredibly inspiring end to the day. Do we have any questions? Maybe I can start.
start with a question, which is just a really basic question, actually. I'm just intrigued. You may have said that the pouches and the coral, what are they themselves made from?
So they are actually, in the end, we had to make them in PLA, but we were trying to work with making our own kind of filament for the 3D printer made of the algae. This is only a 9 months project, so it's not the time.
If you could really say a little bit more.
So the cake is actually it's a mixture of alginate, other chemicals to kind of activate, make the bioplastic. It was basically just cast in quite a big sheet and dyed with different colors that were taken from natural dyes from algae, and cut.
I have some questions.
And I'm kind of interested in the human interaction with all these new living materials or semi-living materials. So what does sweat do to them?
It would hydrate it, yeah.
Would it melt then?
It wouldn't melt it, but it would start to soften it up, and of course create circumstances where it can get contaminated with other microbes that would take form in there.
Yeah, I would like to ask if you can explain a bit more the process behind speculation. So what does inspire you? How you involve, if you involve yourself in the process, and which way?
In which one? And just in general?
Well, this, let's say from your perspective, so doesn't, or if you want to pick up one, which one to prefer?
Well, I think the main thing that we've, or I've also been looking at through working with living organisms is how do we actually combine them? How do we change the way we approach, the way we design, how our wardrobes, our objects around us, and how do we engage with the living organism in that way? So by addressing it and kind of trying to collaborate with it is to understand how they behave. Of course, these are organisms that don't speak. So we have to understand them in the way that they look, the patterns that they create, the smell, or, in this case, we were trying to work with sound. And how do we kind of take those inspirations to design clothing, jewelry? Of course, these are speculative, so it's also us kind of exploring the medium, exploring the living organism and how we implement it. But it's a trial and error basis. It's testing out different vessels, seeing if the organism can grow and can kind of prosper in these containers. And then how do we also feel about them, caring about like a lot of the pieces that we created also are kind of separating us from them. So we have glass pieces, so we are not putting them on our bodies. This is a bit more kind of, well, this is a bioplastic, but it's on our bodies. But when we're actually taking the living organism, we are separating them, but we're trying to kind of highlight how we can get this dialogue going, like how can we start to integrate them.
Hello, a beautiful presentation, of course, from me. I was quite curious to know about how is this regarding the shoulder pods for the algae. The biomass transfer is equally important for it to reproduce again and again over the period of time. So how that biomass transfer is engaged into a human program of day-to-day life when it comes as a product or a human wearable?
So the idea, of course, originally was having a regenerative material that we're able to grow, form our clothing, and then in time we can compost them and grow other materials. So it was, and that's still the hope, to kind of create a more circular process with the organism. So maintaining it living and prospering in our wearables, but then once they've ended their life cycles, be able to harvest the biomass and generating clothing for our wardrobe, basically.
Yeah. We have another question in the audience. There's one on the line. We have a question.
Actually, two questions from Elise or for me. The first one is, Thora, can you explain us how you are capable to combine and come up with so many amazing interdisciplinary projects with various organisms? And the second one, how does your artistic practice influences your academic practice and vice versa?
I always work in collaborations. Like I said in the beginning, there's no way you can really begin to work with. So my background is architect and designer, so I don't know if that was ever taught, but like getting into this field always requires you to work collaboratively. So that's how I'm able to work on different projects. This informs my academic look in the way it makes me kind of speculate a bit differently about how we're approaching living materials, specifically for the built environment. Are we approaching them from this kind of top-down approach where we're trying to take an inert material and shape it, or are we trying to move more towards using living system and living processes and how to actually build new manufacturing techniques and new approaches to building not only our clothing, that's more speculative, but actually how do we implement this then in the built environment? So that's maybe kind of how it connects. Yeah.
Another question. It's from John Mickish, who, by the way, also exhibits in our artifact and showcase. So you should have a look. Wonderful presentation, and I truly appreciate your aesthetic and novel proposals to embrace a living organism. However, I wonder, how has your practice your content with the messiness of prototyping and production and the waste associated with this? Do your systems allow you to recycle scraps of garments, or is it the focus on the production of the products?
So for the production of this particular garment, so this was, I have to say that this was during COVID time. So there was a team in Barcelona and then a team here. So I was not actually physically involved in making the bioplastic itself. So I'm not sure how much waste came from that, to be honest. We talk about that. That's something like using waste is something that is more of a newer approach in my other projects, is actually being able to take out the aggregates that I'm using or nutrients and trying to repurpose them in another project or in another cycle of the material production. Yeah.
I have a bit of a question myself, which is maybe framing some of that in a slightly broader context, because I know that you work and you're practicing. What strikes me about this is a really admirable aim of trying to work with the organism and finding ways to have a mutually beneficial relationship. But then when we're talking about creating things, there is, we've talked about waste, we've talked about the fact that other elements still need to be used in the design and so on. How, in your experience, how far do you think we are from achieving those aims? That's going to be very broad, but to narrow it a little, what positive examples are you seeing that are moving us in the right direction?
In terms of designing with?
In terms of designing, what small wins have you seen or things that are helping us to
I mean, I think a forum like this today, for instance, that there's a lot more researchers involved in this topic. When I started, that was not so much, or it wasn't so obvious, and I feel like there's a lot bigger community starting. There's a lot more conversation about these things, a lot more questions, a lot more criticism, and I think like that's what's inspiring me to keep on going. There's movement and there's aspirations to really collaborate with living organisms, which is, it's quite an exciting space to work in.
Well, if there are no other questions, I think that's a very good note to end on. So thank you very much, Thora. And yeah, I'd like to give us all our thanks to Thora now.